So we have Laura Queen, again, the CEO of 29 Bison. We have Chuck Zwicker, the Chief Operating Officer of Weidenhammer, a digital consulting firm focused on meeting the technology needs of companies in this fast-changing world. Bill Morrow is the managing partner of Empirical Consulting Solutions, who focuses on marketing, sales, and client engagement. And also Fred Massanova, managing partner of Baker Tilly for the Pennsylvania region, focused on accounting, finance, and compliance. Now, before I turn the floor over to our panelists to further introduce themselves, just a couple of comments on our structure for today. Since each one of our panelists has a different area of expertise, we're going to tackle a couple of topics that are common to all, as well as towards the end of the panel discussion, have a deeper dive into each one of those areas of expertise. And we're also going to try and handle this in somewhat of a chronological way as we work through what are the traditional needs of private equity, how has that changed in the last 7 months since COVID struck, what do we see as far as the needs for the next 6 months as we return to normal, and then also what do we see the market looking like a year from now in what we hope is going to be a post-COVID world. If you have any questions during the panel today, please enter them into the chat box. Georgianne is going to be monitoring that, and we'll be feeding those questions into the panel as they come up. And then, as Mona mentioned, after we're done with our panel discussion, please stick around for the networking sessions afterwards. Those have proven to be very, very beneficial and enjoyable sessions, and I'm sure our panelists would love to stick around and share some more of their knowledge. So with that, as I get a drink of water, I'd like to turn this over and ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves a little bit more and share about their practice and how they typically engage with private equity firms. Laura, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Again, Laura Queen, the CEO and founder of 29 Bison. We are a mergers and acquisitions advisory firm focused on human capital working in the mid-market, generally speaking, organizations 5 million to 500 million or so, specifically focused on human capital. Our range of services includes just about everything you can think of related to the people aspects of business operation, buy, sell side, and value creation for those organizations that are hitting some kind of strategic threshold and think that diagnosing opportunities focused on people would be helpful to them.
I'll go next, Bill. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Chuck Zwicker. As Bill had indicated, I'm Chief Operating Officer of Weidenhammer. Bill, thanks for the introduction. I'm not sure I can do better than that. Weidenhammer, really, for those who may not know us, we're a local company. We were started in Philadelphia area in 1978. We operate as what I would call a technology and marketing consulting firm. We do a lot of work in the digital transformation space. So really, a lot of our focus is helping our clients to innovate, to disrupt, to grow in this digital marketplace that everybody's trying to figure out and live within. So a lot of the work that we do on the front end tends to be around driving improved customer experience. We do a lot of work around digital marketing and branding. Transactionally, we have a practice that focuses on a lot of business automation and process improvement through software and e-commerce platforms. We're big into big data and analytics, which is something we'll talk about here today. And then we have an infrastructure business that really focuses on networking, computing, cloud enablement, and communication infrastructures, which again has been busy in this world as organizations and their workforces have moved remotely. Just brief on my background, I'm 30-year plus in the technology industry, have led and worn multiple hats from consulting to leading sales and marketing teams, operation teams. I've worked in both startup businesses, both bootstrapped and angel investing, as well as larger organizations like Weidenhammer, where I've been for the last 14 years. A fair amount of experience in working with larger tech manufacturing organizations and channel partnerships. Relative to private equity, one of Weidenhammer's focus areas from an industry standpoint is in financial services. So that is inclusive of private equity as well as traditional lenders, investment advisors, and kind of specialty firms. So some of the needs across those segments in that industry are similar. Some are a little bit more unique. I'm relegated as the technology guy today in this panel discussion. So a lot of my input and hopefully value will be really more around, kind of where technology is is changing, where there's challenges, where there's opportunities, and where we see the world heading in the private equity market from a technology standpoint. Appreciate you being here.
Great, thanks, Chuck. Bill?
Thanks, Bill, for introducing us and having me on the panel. I'm honored. This is a great panel. We are a business transformation company working across most functional areas of a business: sales, marketing, operations, finance, and HR. I oversee the sales and marketing practice, as you mentioned. And we work in the private equity space, typically with companies that are in portfolios and private equity that focus in on those closely held companies, buying them for the first time and transitioning them into the private equity world. So we help them provide the execution they need in order to move the needle. And that's our goal, and that's who we work with.
Great, thank you, Bill. And Fred?
Great, thanks for having me today. My name's Fred Masnova. I'm the managing partner of Pennsylvania for Baker Tilly. Baker Tilly is a top 10 accounting firm and nationally recognized domestically. We're also an international network, which is a top 8 international network. So I focus a lot of my time working in the private equity space as one of the leaders in the firm. Been doing this for a pretty long time, about 20-something years. Actually started out working in private with a company that sold to private equity, went into public accounting for my first go around, and actually was focused mostly on financial services and specialty finance type companies. Then went inside and worked at a private equity firm for a little while, but loved the abuse of public accounting. So I went back about 7 years ago to Baker Tilly and have been helping build out what the private equity practice is in the East for the firm. So glad to be here.
Great. Well, thank you all for for rolling out those introductions. So let's move right into our first topic. And our first topic is really, it's a two-part question. And the first part is, what have been the traditional needs of private equity firms? And the second part is sort of, how has this changed since COVID started 6 or 7 months ago? So Bill, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Yeah, I think you see traditionally private equity from our standpoint has needed additional support both in due diligence and in execution, and getting them to the next level, getting their portfolio companies to the next level. We've seen that obviously transition tremendously as deal guys got a little bored in March when all the deals came off the table and they started looking internally. And we found that there were new needs and new opportunities for us to support their portfolio companies and their direction when it came to marketing and sales, because they didn't have, and I'm sure Chuck's going to talk about this more down the line, they didn't quite have their ducks in a row in some of these companies from a standpoint of their digital transformation, and really struggled in communicating and connecting with their clientele and the people that were out there. So while the traditional stuff is starting to come back, the due diligence, and we're seeing more deal flow, there was a real change in focus to the digital world.
Great, thanks, Bill. Laura?
I think from a human capital standpoint, more traditionally, the focus of private equity has been on the component parts of human capital that appear on the balance sheet. So looking at wages, salaries, pension benefits. What we have been seeing both pre-COVID and certainly since then, and partly I think also as a result of the changing, the changing landscape around things like social and racial justice and injustice issues, have more to do with things like understanding leadership capacities and capability in their business, making sure that they have the right leaders to handle not only a world that seems to be disrupted by the chaos that's living around us, but also the opportunity that gets created around creating more diverse and inclusive work environments. Certainly looking at things like pay parity and pay equity have become, I think, more typical conversations for us during this time. And to be quite honest, I hope to some degree that persists over time. To Bill's point, we're seeing We had seen kind of a fall off from a due diligence standpoint around human capital. We are beginning to see some of those deal flows pick back up. However, the other thing that we're seeing a really significant focus on is portfolio company operation. So making sure that cash flow is being managed appropriately, that internal efficiencies and employee productivity and performance. Certainly physical safety has become something that is of significant concern for organizations at this time.
Great, thanks, Laura. And Fred, from the financial side, I know working with private equity firms, it's been a bit of a whirlwind. So just share with us what you guys have seen over the last 6 months.
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, a little bit, I guess, tying in with Bill and Laura said also. So prior to COVID hitting, you know, the tide was continuing to rise. Deal flow was good. You know, the thesis from a financial standpoint was still intact for a lot of these PE firms. So they were continuing to, you know, business as usual. We saw a lot of demand from, you know, diligence side, tax structuring side, those types of traditional type questions that were coming in as they ran their aggregation plays and looked to, you know, continue to move the ball down the field. I think what happened when COVID hit was, you know, you saw, so there were always, you know, everybody always knows there's cracks in the ship, and when something hits like this, you start seeing those cracks a little bit more, and that's where, you know, data integrity came in play. So Bill mentioned about the digital transformation that maybe a lot of these companies were going through, and then they realized that the on-demand data that they were pulling out of their portcos to help navigate through an issue like this, these headwinds, may not have been as precise as they thought. And then at the same point, when you had this, you know, on March 13th or March 4th, whatever date it was, where you had this flee from physical locations into a virtual work environment, what did that mean for your workforce? How were you going to do that? I'm sure Chuck will talk a little bit about security around that situation, so I won't steal that. So then it really did come back to, from a financial standpoint, it wasn't as aggressive. It was more, you know, how are we going to shore up balance sheets? How are we going to look at cash management? A lot of questions around CARES Act, a lot of questions about how are we going to now pivot and navigate, you know, maybe the new tax laws, old tax laws, and really start taking advantage of these to weather the storm. So that's where we saw that huge transition in that March and April timeframe. Recently, deal flow has picked up a little bit more, but so I actually spoke on a panel beginning of last year and talked about the speed of deals, and I think everybody on this webinar will realize that deals were at an incredible rate last year. I mean, deals were just closing in an unbelievable short amount of time. And what I've noticed when we've come back from this, that deals have now got back to what I would say is a more normal pace, a more traditional timeline, because buyers are a little more wary. They want to take the time, and that's, you know, that's always good for the advisors, because, you know, time is great. You know, you can leverage the time to make sure that you're doing the right level of analysis and diligence and helping your PE firm client. So that's a little bit on what I think that, you know, flying into the storm and how we've navigated so far.
I heard the CARES Act. Does that include all the fun of the PPP loan and the process behind that?
Oh yeah, all the fun of that. So, you know, I don't know if we have any bankers on today, but, you know, the banks have done, I'd say they've done an amazing job. And, you know, I would say, you know, regardless of your political alignment, we have to give Powell and Mnuchin a big thumbs up for what they were able to do with Congress and get that pushed out, because it really did stabilize the economy in some way, and allowed for this funding to go through to small, medium-sized companies, which, again, private equity had to navigate the affiliate rules there to make sure that we helped a little bit with that, to make sure that they were able to get the money appropriately. And now we're dealing with, you know, I think a lot of people are dealing with the forgiveness side of it, making sure that the applications for forgiveness are properly done. So I say that because the financial services world, you know, in February would have never thought we need to set up a platform to push out trillions of dollars from a government agency, and then within 24 weeks, we're going to have to be able to process how we just pretty much cancel this debt, which is amazing. I mean, again, I think we have to take a step back and look at that entire process in a 6-month window. What we were able to do from a financial standpoint is pretty amazing.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Chuck, technology's enabled a lot of activities. So why don't you share with us what you guys have seen?
Yeah. Before I do, just Fred, just back to you. I kind of curious though. We're still seeing, because I've seen a lot of the deal flow slow down, but there's a lot of uncalled capital out there still. I mean, I saw a note as we were preparing for this last week. The statistic blew me away. There's still like $2.5 trillion in uncalled capital out there, and like 800 billion of that is for buyouts. So it seems like a lot of these companies are kind of keeping their, how would you say, they keep their powder dry, right? But they're still going to be on the lookout for deals because they're kind of on the clock for that. So we saw that slow down too, but I sense that that's going to pick up as things kind of start to normalize, whatever this new normal looks like that we're going to head into here. Bill, from a technology standpoint, we've seen this, right? We saw kind of PE, and especially, the general partners kind of went into like triage mode very quickly, right? So we didn't see a whole lot of due diligence and new business development work being done. It was really how do they stabilize their portfolios and the companies that they're working with. So the traditional stuff that we saw that, are just kind of table stakes, the CRM, fund accounting, corporate accounting, portfolio management, right? All of a sudden we shifted away from that. And a lot of the work on that pre-COVID was around how to integrate that, how to pull out data, how to deal with big data and the analytics behind it for due diligence. We'll talk about that as we go downstream in the panel today. But really, almost overnight, what we saw changing was relative to stabilizing their portfolios. All of a sudden, business continuity, disaster recovery became very quick to the forefront, right? Because they realized a lot of their organizations didn't have these plans in place. Now you've got a whole workforce moving out of bricks and mortar into remote into teleworking. That then exposed the cybersecurity risks, and the cybersecurity side of it has just been huge in the tech business, not just in PE but across the board. But we've seen as much as a 600% rise in security threats, beginning in March for like the first 3 or 4 months of that time frame. So you saw a lot of companies in financial services get very serious very quickly around like phishing exercises, education of their workforces on how to detect and prevent a particular threat that's tied to spear phishing, that's tied to ransomware. We saw a lot of work around strengthening of what we call the network perimeter, relative to security, endpoint protection, hardening devices, especially as they went out of the building, patching of software. This is kind of table stakes type stuff that doesn't get done a lot on a systematic basis that all of a sudden people got religion around. The other component that we'll talk about here today is really this concept of workforce mobility. So most firms did a nice job of getting their workforces set up remotely, but that didn't mean they knew how to work with the platforms and the technologies that they rolled out to them. So there's a lot of work being done now around what I'll call adoption of how to work in this new environment where we're not all physically working together. So part of it is, are you locking down the environments from a security standpoint so your data is protected, so your communications are protected? But 2, are you training your workforce on how to use these platforms effectively? And then the last part of it that I would say ties to this as well is just extending that out to kind of the ecosystem, right? We're doing that today. So, how do you use some of these technologies like web conferencing effectively to have the same type of experience that they had pre-COVID? So again, some of these things we'll probably we'll drill down into further today, but really business continuity, the security aspects, the workforce mobility aspects of it. That's what we saw very quickly change that was there pre-COVID, but not to the degree that companies are looking at it now out of necessity.
Great, great. So thank you for those comments, and that kind of brings us up to where we are today. We've been through 7 months of COVID, and the world has changed. And now let's roll forward to the next 6 months or so as we re-engage with work, as deal flow starts to pick back up again, as industries start to reopen. What do you see as trends and needs that are coming up that will need to be tackled certainly between now and the end of this fiscal year, but also over the first couple of months into next year? So with that, Laura, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Couple of things, and I'm going to go back to a comment that Chuck just made, speaking specifically around remote work environment. I've had a number of conversations in the last probably week or so with organizations who have said their anticipation at a minimum is that to the extent it's possible, they won't bring their employees back full-time, all of their employees into a co-working environment, probably until April or perhaps even after that. And one of the things that we have heard from organizations, both GPs and Portco operating leaders, is issues around performance, productivity, managing the role of a manager and a leader in an environment where you are not proximate with all of your other employees, and the concerns they have around issues of mental health, for example. Many of these employees are working double, triple, in some cases quadruple duty. They are the chief cook and bottle washer at home. They're working for their businesses and trying to be productive and efficient. They're handling school-age children that they may never have had to have handled, FaceTime with. And in many cases, they're dealing with circumstances where they have elder or other family members also living in homes with them that require some level of care and keeping. So how do you manage all of that process in an environment where you're tripping over each other and making food takes precedence 3, 4, 5 times a day? So all of those kinds of issues are, we're seeing them sort of crop up. One of the other things that we're beginning to see now that things are coming back online in various parts of our area is the issue of concern around employees returning to a work environment when they're fearful for their own physical safety. And so how does that get managed? What is it that needs to happen in order to make employees feel comfortable about their return to work circumstances? What options are available? Are there creative ways of thinking about how to get work done in various environments that can be utilizing technology to facilitate some of that process? Making sure that video conversation is a relational building opportunity, not just a performance and productivity piece, is something we're seeing kind of come full circle for many employers.
Hey, Bill, if I can jump into that just to tie
Sure.
in with what Laura's saying. Laura brings up some good points. I mean, just frankly, we're never going to go back.
Nope.
Maybe this is a bold prediction of mine. We're never going to go back to the workforce that we had before, the way that we worked, right? Genie's out of the bottle. I know in my own organization of 180 people, 25% of my workforce never worked in a bricks and mortar office that we had. Right now, the rest of them are at home and they realize that, geez, I've really cut my costs down in terms of travel, wear and tear, quality of life issues. We need to strike a balance between, at the point where it's safe to bring people back to work, you can bring them back to build relationships, build trust so that they can work together remotely, right? That's the biggest challenge is, we're onboarding new people now who have never physically worked with their teammates. So it's great that the technology is there to allow them to do it technically, but it doesn't allow for us to build trust and relationships. And that's so important when we're starting to do, kind of work on the front end with organizations, just not within our own company. I think you're going to see office spaces change and the technology requirements change along with them, right? We're looking now in our offices to move away from, everybody gets an office or a physical cubicle to you move to a hoteling environment because your whole workforce isn't coming on site all the time. A lot of the space that we have is going to get converted to conference rooms, the huddle rooms. The technology that's going to be put into them is going to allow us to pull in people. You're starting to see an uptick in video endpoints. in collaboration rooms where you've got whiteboards that are video endpoints and whiteboard technology that I can share information, with people that I'm bringing in. That drives a whole new set of requirements around bandwidth, network requirements. How do I secure these experiences that are going on? So, to Laura's point, there's a human element here. What we see from a technology standpoint is, what's the office of the future look like, and what's the technology and technology requirements look like to support this? Because I just don't see us going back to the way it was pre-COVID.
Yeah, it's a great point. We'll jump in a few minutes into the longer term, but I think you hit the nail right on the head. It's not something we're going to go back. And, a lot of what we focus on is how does our own office change? But, the other parameter is how do we engage with our clients? So along those notes, Bill, as we look at over the next 6 months, client engagement, sales and marketing, and the trend towards digital and remote work, how do you see that playing out and needs changing?
Yeah, well, I can't tell you how many people came to us in March and April and said, "Hey, I've got all this money. I'm going to do what we were going to do in these events, and now what do I do? And how do I put this to work? And where do we meet people?" And we've seen that change pretty rapidly. And we're really seeing two categories. We've got the people that are sticking their head in the sand. And I agree with Chuck. Nothing's going back to the way it was. There's going to be changes, and you got to accept that. But we're still seeing companies that say, "Hey, next year is going to be different. We're just going to save that money, and we're going to go back to the way we did business." But I think in the reality is we're finding that people are accepting and using these opportunities, these changes. And we're seeing virtual conferences and webinars be very effective tools to drive and create new business. And it's going to continue to be very customer facing. And as more and more people accept it, you're going to see haves and have-nots, where companies that have accepted that, made investments in their digital marketing, their digital transformation on the client engagement side, are going to do very well. We've had clients that are in the $20-30 million range do webinars and pick up $2 and $3 million off a webinar. You wouldn't have seen that 5 months, 8 months ago, but now you're seeing that type of work, and they're going to do well. And the ones that don't, I think, are going to really suffer and struggle. And you're seeing private equity firms, probably more than we've seen in the past, force some of their portfolio companies into this new world, the ones that are dragging a little bit. We're getting more and more introductions where they used to be soft introductions. "Hey, you should talk to Bill and his team because they do a nice job," to "You will be using Bill and his team to make these changes in your business."
All right, great. And Fred, finally back to you. Most of us deal with the next 6 months as sort of a rolling topic, but there is this end of the fiscal year coming up. So how do you see that playing out, and what are the needs going to be in the next 3 months, and then the 3 months after that?
Yeah. So, first there's an event that's coming up that's probably going to navigate what the end of the year looks like from a tax perspective. So we need to make sure that happens. And I think there's a lot of noise and stress in the system related to that, which is what we're talking about a lot with a bunch of different PE firms. But I also think that the other thing from a financial standpoint, touching on a little bit of, starting to look forward, but not that far forward, is this realization. So when a lot of the companies, portcos flew into the storm, there was this concept of just take 2020's fiscal year budget and kick it out a year to fiscal 21. And it's just a 1 year deferral, and then we're going to get right back on the track. And I think now there's a little bit more of a realization that may not be the case, and that there's going to need to be some, real financial planning and forecasting, and looking at cost structures around things like, what does an assembled workforce look like going forward? How are we going to train people in a more hybrid environment? Supply chain disruption. We could forecast out what we think we could sell, but can we even get the product? A lot of people were focusing on demand, not focusing on supply, which hasn't come back yet. So there's a lot of looking at those types of things. There's the flip from now, if we're going to spend more on cyber and virtual training, and we're saving that on travel and events and physical spaces, how do we adjust that? And then the other thing is from a diligence perspective, how are PEs, and this is why I said, Chuck mentioned there's a lot of capital on the sideline. I said it's a little more patient because they're, trying to let the game come to them a little bit, because a company, you think about it, in a trailing 12 or trailing 24, you still have, I would say, what I used to call the good old days in there. And that is that a realistic representation of what it's going to look like in the next 6 months? And then how do you forecast out what that is, what's going to look like over the next 12 months? So, I think every buyer out there is taking a little more time trying to figure out, not only can they bounce back, but when they bounce back, what are they going to look like from a cost structure perspective, from a demand perspective, from a supply perspective, and from a tax perspective? So when you put them all together, it's probably better to move a little bit slower and make sure that you really do understand all the things that could impact a deal and impact an investment, and make sure that what you're doing still sticks to what your investment thesis is. And that doesn't even talk about industries that are going to take a long time to bounce back, and exposure to those industries, aerospace, hospitality, those types of things are not even, you have to layer that in on top of how you're going to forecast based on your client base. So, next 6 months, I think it's the realization that the punt the budget 1 year is not as fail safe as it was 4 or 5 months ago, and that there's going to be some real scrutiny, reevaluation, forecasting. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for advisors to get in there and really start looking at how we can help these companies navigate what this realization is going to be.
Yeah, I think, and what I've heard is things like valuation and Q of E are going to be a challenge until there is some clarity and some track record that's reestablished.
Well, and the other thing I'll send, we didn't even mention the credit. I mean, credit markets are tight now, right? So, I say I put the banks in the world of, it's not 2008. They came in from they have a brick house in the storm. They took all their friends and family down into the basement, closed the doors, and outsiders, you gotta really tell a good story to get in. So credit markets are tight, which doesn't help. But it doesn't help from a deal flow perspective. So PEs know, like, hey, we're not going to be able to lever it up as much as we had in the past. So you spend a little more time with it.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. So now let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into each one of the disciplines. And we've talked about how we've gotten to where we are today. What does the next 6 months look like? But I'd ask our panelists to picture the world post-COVID, which we hope is going to be a year from now. But what do we see as the needs for those private equity firms, the needs of the industry at that point? And it's not just as we come out of COVID, but it's also, addressing, as Fred mentioned, we have an election coming up, we have social issues, et cetera. But Fred, let's come back to you, since you seem to have a very broad overview. How do you see the industry a year from now once we get into that post-COVID world?
So PE overall, I think, they're going to have a very different investment thesis going forward. I think that they're going to, not very different. Look, they're still looking for quality investments that they can create value in and exit, right? I mean, that doesn't change, but I think the way they look at how they're going to create value is going to change from the traditional methods. And a lot of the conversation that we've already had, digital transformation, leveraging human capital the right way. I mean, the one thing that, and I'll let Laura speak more to this than me, talent wars were, very apparent in February. I don't think in a year from now, I think in a year from now that returns. At least that's my case. But Laura, you're the expert. I'll let you speak to that. But when that comes back, how are you going to look at in the new world? How are you going to look at, making sure that you're able to attain the talent to execute? Once this all settles down, I'm sure that international trade, as I mentioned earlier, the supply chain is going to change. Does that mean that we're going to be doing more domestically to make sure that we don't have this type of exposure going forward? Where does PE play into that type of investment strategy? Chuck mentioned automation, cyber. There's going to be big spends in that area. We really need to evaluate how that's going to impact this investment, because there's going to be a virtual component to the workforce going forward. And I'll tell you this, the one thing, and we were talking about this pre-panel, bad actors out there, they know They know that there's stress in the system. They know that there's there's opportunity for the bad actors, the companies out there that are trying to pound passwords. They see opportunity too. So it's important for companies to think about how do we continuously invest in that. So going forward, again, the overall investment thesis of buy a company, create value, and exit it is intact, but that value creation component of it is going to look a lot different a year from now, 2 years from now, and PEs that pivot well into it and get away a little bit from the more traditional model are going to see it in the exit value, and that's where us as advisors can really step in and create that value. I know there's probably different industries represented here. There's opportunities in finance, in insurance, the ways that we can definitely help the PE pivot into what the new value creation model looks like is going to be important. And again, my role would be, as an accountant, we're looking at the tax side of it, making sure that we're navigating whatever the tax code is going to look like in 2 years from now, because I'll tell you, it'll probably continuously change as domestic needs, and regardless of who wins, there's going to need to be tax policy put in place to continue growth in the U.S.
Great, thanks, Fred. So Laura, one of the things I've heard from you is this great line about, the future is the humanization of business. And we have had so many issues in the whirlwind over the last 6 months. And why don't you take a few minutes and tell us how you see the human capital management scene a year from now?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball. Mine's a little cracked, but I think Fred makes a really good point about talent. I think as the world begins to, I'll say, kind of come back online, there will be a war for talent, but it will be very different than it was a year ago. The talent capabilities, the success criteria for businesses has shifted. We've heard that from many of our GP colleagues who have said to us, where we thought we had really strong management teams, what's happened in this period of time has really shed light on the need for organization leadership to be resilient, to find ways to be innovative and creative, to find opportunities to collaborate within their organizations and externally in order to meet the shifting needs of an environment or a consumer population or the reduced demand for their products and services. So it's not just a matter of coming back to the way things used to be. It's recognizing how the world has changed and what is required in order for an organization or a team to be successful, and what the customer demand or the societal demand might look and feel like at that particular point in time. So I think focus on the customer relationship building, understanding what their shifting demands are, is going to be really critically important. And then backing into what are the role requirements, job responsibilities, and how is it that you go out and seek that kind of capability and or build it internally if it doesn't exist. What's the capacity of an organization to train, to innovate, to create new capabilities for their existing workforce in order for them to be truly efficient, effective, and productive in this new environment is going to be really critical. I think aside from just the world of private equity, the other things that we're seeing in the world of human capital sort of writ large is a shift toward human capital metrics. For those of you that have been paying attention to what's happening at the SEC, you'll see that the new SEC's Reg SK modernization ruling will really impact publicly traded organizations' level of disclosure around human capital, but that has a trickle-down effect. And we know that many LPs out there have an interest in understanding the material human capital issues in publicly traded organizations, but they have flows into these alternative investments. And so it's going to put pressure on smaller, mid-sized organizations to develop internal technical capabilities, processes, and procedures to be able to inform investors and investment decisions and operating decisions about human capital in ways that hasn't existed before. And that will come relatively quickly.
All right, thanks, Laura. So Bill, as we look a year out from now, and we look at the evolution of business, for those of us who have lived on an airplane in the past, do we see the road warrior ever coming back? And how do we see sales evolving a year from now?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a mix. I do think there's going to be a place in the world for people getting on planes and heading out. I am this afternoon. We'll see how that goes. But I think you're going to see that. You're going to see people go out and do that type of work. But there's going to be a mix, because the same CEOs and private equity operating partners that told me you can't run my business without doing face-to-face work are learning that's just not true. A lot of them have been very successful, and a lot of them continue to drive new business. So I think you're going to see a kind of a mix, and it's going to be a balance of what we saw in the past and what we're going to do moving forward. We do a lot of work with companies that we'll call them get your hands dirty companies, and they've really made a tremendous amount of change in the last 6 months to embracing the technologies and utilizing them to drive their businesses overall. So where it ends up exactly in a year, Bill, are we going to be on planes twice a month instead of 4 times? It's probably going to be something like that, where you do some face-to-face work. But we're already seeing conferences next year being put off to virtual conferences already. So next July and August. So I think it's here to stay to some degree.
Excellent. Excellent. The world has turned to digital marketing and digital customer management. And, what do you see as the trends in that as we go forward?
Yeah, I think, we're seeing a really nice trend, and especially the ones that are doing it well, is we talk about value creation internally from private equity standpoint, where that's what they're trying to do. But companies that are adding value and creating value to their end users are seeing tremendous success. It's less about selling. It's more about providing value to that end user and your audience, and making sure you're moving forward with them as partners and not telling them or trying to sell them something. Companies, again, that have engaged that in webinars and digital marketing and reach outs have been wildly successful. And as simple as demonstrating and showing people how to use your equipment and your tools we've watched that turnaround business in a real hurry. And I think that's going to continue. We saw that shift in sales in 2008 when the financial crisis, and it's continuing, and it's going to be amplified by this. And you need to add value to your end user, or they're just not going to use you. All
right, great. And so Chuck, on to you. Somebody mentioned that we've seen 10 years of technology evolution in the last 10 weeks. Where do we end up as we get out of COVID, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so a lot of notes here. Bill, I'm going to pivot on you. I'm going to be like one of the candidates last night. I want to go back and answer the earlier question that you didn't give me time for, right? And then I'll answer your question now. Fred mentioned something that we've seen further a trend that I think is going to kind of take us into the future here, right? So Fred had mentioned, and we've seen it too. The credit market's tightened up. Banks are putting lending for kind of new deals on hold as they're kind of going through triage and trying to stabilize what they have. So I think what's going to happen out of that, we saw, kind of high yield lending slowed down even before COVID, right? So all these forces are going to now start to make us see that lenders are going to take more time now to assess risk. Underwriting is going to go through a lot more scrutiny. But from a technology standpoint, we're seeing being driven by those factors is speed, right? Reporting is becoming much more complex through every stage of the life cycle, right? So you're not doing this on spreadsheets anymore. And the challenge and the opportunity from a technology standpoint is PE firms are dealing with so much data that how do they get that data kind of through the system, crunched down to have one version of truth, and are they using all their data effectively? Right, there's the opportunity. It's both a challenge and an opportunity, but the trends that we're seeing in PE are companies are now starting to look much more around integration of their different systems, which has always been an issue, but it's coming to the forefront now. How do I integrate the data that I've got in my CRM and my relationship management systems, with fundraising, with deal management, with investor relations? How do I bring that all together? Because as we're doing due diligence, I mean, look at all the data that's just in email systems that doesn't get utilized. So when I'm starting to do due diligence on a certain industry sector or an organization, can I get at that domain knowledge in my systems to be able to make educated decisions and quickly make decisions, right? So the good side of that is the technologies have matured to the point now you're starting to see really unique situations come out with machine learning, with artificial intelligence, and with cloud computing, right? Where I can really bring in large amounts of data, ingest it, manage it, automate it, so that I can do a better job of crunching down the reporting, which has become more complex, and kind of speeding up the time to market to be able to make some of these decisions. So again, because of some of the factors that started pre-COVID, that got exacerbated in COVID, it's going to drive some of the demand for some of these technologies that, you know, have been around for a while now. PE firms haven't necessarily taken them, I wouldn't say seriously, but there hasn't been as much of a drive as there's going to be now coming out of COVID.
All right, great, thanks. Laura, I'd like to come back to you on something that, you know, one of the things that we've seen is a renewed focus on ESG, on diversity and inclusion. It typically has not been, you know, in a Portco environment, the highest area of focus. But have you seen LPs focused on this? Have you seen general partners start to focus more on this? And is that going to be more of an issue as we go forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I believe the answer to that is yes. And even for us, we're seeing more and more of our traditional due diligences, which have, I will say, historically consisted primarily of compliance and risk-based kind of components. We're seeing more and more of those engagements move beyond the risk-based components to areas of leadership capability, overall talent capability, understanding of culture, identification of opportunities for facilitated integration, quick, you know, kind of post-closing integration around issues that have been more historically people-focused and less, you know, financial, face to the customer or technology focused. As it relates to issues around ESG, one of the things we're seeing, hearing a lot more of is I won't say less of a focus, more of a balance on the S component of ESG as organizations are looking at their sustainability efforts and initiatives, where up to this point, there has been a much greater view around the environmental and governance components of the way businesses are operating and the investment, you know, LP's focus around carbon footprint and some of those kinds of things. What we're seeing more and more of, particularly at the LP level, is an interest in understanding overall diversity at the board level, diversity at the management level, areas of things like pay parity and pay equity in the operation of businesses, understanding what the world of discrimination might look like, I'll say unintentionally, in a business as it relates to things like hiring practices, promotional practices, opportunities for advancement in those businesses. And so you're seeing a much greater focus on the S component in all the way down, from LPs, GPs, all the way down to port cooperation.
Okay, great. All right, so we've had a nice look at what the market's going to look like in the private equity space and for portfolio companies and investors, you know, today and for the next year. You know, let's bring this back. We've got a lot of service providers on the call this morning. So what does this mean for service providers in the coming months and year, and how should they be looking at meeting the needs of their clients, and how do they look at getting more engaged in that segment of the market? So Chuck, since you didn't answer my last question, let's start off with you.
Yeah, so my take on this, Bill, will really be obviously more from a technology standpoint. I mean, we're seeing a couple different factors that PE firms are looking at and financial firms are looking at in service providers. One, the world has moved to a consumption model. So, you know, where we would go, really what people are looking for now is what I'll call managed services, right? They want us to come in, and they want their service providers to come in and manage the process for them. They want to pay for what they eat. Right. So the big shift that we've seen in technology spends, which has affected balance sheets and cash flows, is, you know, the days of big CapEx expenses to buy computing power, networking power applications is gone. Now it's really more of an operational expense that's getting rolled into a monthly fee on either based on a fixed set of services, a fixed set of managed services that are being provided by the service provider, or based on consumption. So that's driven down cost. I mean, the good side to that for consumers of technology is it's allowed you to kind of have a fixed cost on a monthly basis, get away from this big upfront CapEx type model, establish SLAs for that monthly, service fee, and just kind of have predictable service levels with it. So we've seen a change with that. The other thing I would say too, from a service provider, the opportunities tend to be in the technology industry is that most companies, when you talk about digital transformation, that's an overused term, but all companies realize that they need to digitize a lot of the manual paper-based assets that they have, right? And as much as organizations in financial services has done that, right, they've digitized a lot of the stuff, there's still a lot of work to be done. So there's an opportunity there to help companies move to that digital footprint, right, and get away from paper-based forms and then automate the processes through. There's a difference between digitization, right, and digitalization. I don't want to get too hung up in the words here, but kind of one is have we moved our forms and our assets and that to a digital environment so that I can drive down the cost of it, I can share it, I can distribute it and manage it more easily. Then am I automating my processes for speed and efficiency? There's a lot of work to be done in that. So in that allows us to have opportunity. Then the second part of it comes into if you can help these companies to drive different opportunities, right? So I talked a little bit about integration. A lot of their systems aren't integrated right now, and there's a big push for that to be able to kind of handle their data in a different way and be able to have one source of truth, right? So we're seeing a lot of opportunity right now for companies that can help move these firms to the cloud to drive down the cost of computing, to make it more efficient, to be able to manage their data so that they can then kind of get it in, I'm not going to try and get over technical here, but to get it into one data model, normalize the data so that I can report on it and see a better view of everything I have relative to the underwriting process, the reporting process, the due diligence process. That needs to be sped up and have more rigor in it. And the technology is there today to be able to do that. So if you can align with a company where you can provide those types of services, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of opportunity to bring value to them. Bill, the one other thing I'd hit on just to kind of shift a little bit too on the PE side, and this is opportunity for, it's answer your question, but in a different light is, and this may be evident, but I mean, the IT market is huge and we're experiencing secular growth, right? This isn't cyclical, this is long-term growth. But what I see in my industry here is it's still very fragmented. And there's a lot of opportunity. You're seeing a lot of acquisition going on of small companies being acquired by larger companies to build out their portfolios from a technology standpoint. There's a lot of opportunity in there for PE companies to get in and evaluate technology companies that would benefit from private equity, right? And that, I just see a huge opportunity for that. You've got a whole generation now, is it Generation Z? I lose track of it. I think Generation Z were people that were born, what, 1995 or 96 and on, right? But the early Generation Z is now in the workforce. I mean, they've grown up with this technology and there's a lot of innovation with this generation coming out that represents opportunity from a PE standpoint. So that's good both for PE companies, but it's also good for human capital and people that are starting these companies up that could benefit from what PE brings to the table to kind of mature them and to form out an exit strategy for them.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Thanks for that overview. Laura, from the human capital management side, and Chuck had teed it up, what are some of the other things that you can see that service providers can do to get engaged with this market?
Yeah, I think so. Following on Chuck's note about the infiltration of technology, I think one of the things from a human capital standpoint we're seeing, it particularly now that we're working with remote workforces, is the need to apply technological intervention to that process. So, moving away from the traditional personnel file, for example, and moving onboarding to electronic media, moving to LMS or computer-based training, helping to utilize those technologies to integrate and create greater capability and comfort around the utilization of technology in organizations that, at least to this point, have been less technologically sophisticated, or there has been less of a need for technological sophistication. So I think all of that's really important. In general, I think from the perspective of PE, one of the things that we've been seeing, perhaps related to human capital, but I think more generally, is the idea that organizations are now seeing a need for greater levels of sophisticated due diligence around all kinds of areas of operation that are not just financial or technical or tax. It's not just about Q of E, it's about quality of all kinds of other things. But the concern is, how do we find service providers that have a comprehensive collaborative service offering so that we as a GP aren't forced into a situation where we have to go out and find 14 or 15 different individual service providers and contract with them independently in order to receive the services and meet the needs of an organization that we have as we construct our diligence process. And then perhaps, I think to Chuck's point too, how is it that we utilize those capabilities long-term, both for integration, but for optimization and value creation on down the road? So I think that there's a watch out, at least in my opinion, from a service provider standpoint around how is it that we collaborate with each other? What is it that we do from a cooperative standpoint to make sure that we provide streamlined service offerings to this population of financiers, investors, operators?
Okay, great, thank you. And Bill, from your side?
Now, over the last 6 months, we saw all that brain power that would go out and do deals come in and really look internally to see what they can do to increase value within their companies. And now we're seeing that come out, those ideas come out. And we're seeing a tremendous number of companies, existing companies, that are adding new divisions and new directions, and even building completely new companies out of what they have already existing. And I think that for everyone on this call that's a service provider is a tremendous opportunity, because they need folks that can help build the marketing and sales, obviously, but also business processes. They need new people, new executive leaders. They need folks that can really drive that overall business. So I see this next year or so for the folks that are on this call as a tremendous opportunity. As we're seeing, we have in marketing and sales right now, we have more opportunity than I have people to throw at. So we really need to grow with that and continue to grow. But I think that it's a tremendous opportunity right now.
All right, great, thanks. And Fred, for sort of the last one on this topic, how do you see the service providers getting engaged in this market as we go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ample opportunity coming down the pike, and you really want to say, you know, what if you could tell the future by looking at the past, and you think about other events that have happened, and you know, just going back in the last 2 decades, you think about 9/11 and what happened there, and you know, some of the investment that came out after that with you know, think about TSA didn't exist, Homeland Security didn't exist, those types of you know, whole industries were developed in a short amount of time. And then you go to the financial crisis in 2008 and you start thinking about, you know, what happened within the financial institutions from quality around underwriting and regulation and those types of items that came out of that. And there were opportunities for advisors through those. And I think with COVID, it's going to be the same thing where you're going to see PE start leaning into where we believe the future is going to be, and the future is going to be things that are going to help us to prevent something that could happen like this again, where a pandemic is going to shut down the entire country. So you're going to see biotech, life science, therapeutics. You're going to see money shift into that. You're going to see money shift into, we talked a little bit about, you know, in the middle of COVID, we had social disruption. And I think, you know, Laura talked a little bit about it, where you're going to see more investment into how do we get diversity in thought at, you know, through companies at board levels. I think it's the answer to the talent wars going forward. And I think advisors play a big role in that. And just advising short term on how, I mean, from a financial perspective, we come in and we always just try to make sure that, you know, you have the, I always say, you have the ability to invest in what you want to invest in and pay the bills at the end of the month, and make sure that you give Uncle Sam his piece. But I think beyond that, there is going to be opportunities for all of the advisors to really help PE pivot into different investment fields, into different investment strategies, and different ways that they create value through their platforms.
Great. All right, well, so I'd like to, I mean, we've gone through the sort of set themes that we had set up for the morning. We do have just a couple of minutes left, and, you know, thank you to all of our panelists, but I'd like to open it up just for some sort of final comments and any closing thoughts that you might have. So, Bill?
Yeah, I think as we all talked about, we're in a tremendous period of time, and we're fortunate enough to be here and be actively participating in this. And we probably all could come back in 3 weeks and chat about this again and have a little bit different view. And it's exciting. I think there's going to be tremendous opportunity across the board for everyone here. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the future brings. But I do see positive trends and positive things happening. So I think that's going to continue.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Chuck, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I wrote a couple notes down here, Bill, and this is kind of summary of some of the things we were talking about. I mean, I think the opportunities from a technology standpoint, if I had to boil it down here, are really around analytics. Again, artificial intelligence has come into a level of maturity, and it's embedded with a lot of analytic platforms that PE can leverage effectively now to improve deal sourcing, to improve portfolio management. We need to do a better job of driving the due diligence process and having that single version of truth that I talked about before. So analytics coupled with big data and cloud computing helps us do that. So I would say look into that as an opportunity. We need to do a better job of, I guess I would say, digitizing relationships, right? I talked about leveraging the data that is in our CRM systems, how to pull that out to be able to have access to that wealth of information that we don't leverage enough when we're looking at kind of the upfront deals and how to do due diligence on an organization. So there's opportunity there with technologies that are mature today. And then lastly, I just, again, cloud computing is not a question of does it work? Does it address security concerns that people used to have in the pioneering days of it, right? We're past that. The world has moved to the cloud. It's a good way for PE firms to drive down the cost of computing power, of managing their data, and it can do a much better job of being able to pull massive amounts of data together and to be able to leverage it more effectively to drive efficiencies. From a technology standpoint, if I can't improve efficiency or accuracy or dependability of the data, then why do you invest in it? You got to look at cloud computing capabilities today, and there's a lot out there. So you got to get hooked up with a company that knows what they're talking about and can help you guide through that kind of that roadmap. But as I take away the themes that we've talked about here from a technology standpoint, they're the things I'd really focus on in terms of looking at where technology can drive us in the future in the industry we're in here.
Great, thanks, Chuck. And Laura, final thoughts?
I think it just bears saying we have gone through the Great Reset, but the world in the future is not the world that we've experienced in the past. I think we can learn from the lessons of the past. But it's important for us to be aware about what the trends are for the future and to lean into those trends to create new frameworks and understandings about the way business will operate in the future, and to be a part of finding opportunity and collaboratively creating solutions for the future, reaching into the past but not replicating it.
That's great. That's a great way to look at it. And Fred, wrapping up with you, final thoughts.
Yeah. So, I think the one thing that I'll say when you think about how the future is going to pan out for PE and advisors, there's a couple concepts that we talked about. Chuck talked about IT, but I think it's really the realization that data is an asset, and it's always been an asset, but now I think people really understand how important data is as an asset. Something that was not diligenced before. Laura talked a little bit about human capital and the concept of doing diligence around that. So now when PEs are looking to invest, before it was very heavily tax, financial diligence, just make sure that, what you believe that you were investing in from a numbers perspective made sense, but now it's so much more. So I actually see, the future of advisors with PE being where you're going to see more partnerships. You're going to see more opportunities for us to work in tandem as we help our PE friends out there due diligence, bring in the right level of people to make sure that they're doing either IT, cyber diligence, and HR type diligence, financial diligence, because these things are going to be important to their investment thesis going forward. Things that, maybe before we all went at the market separately, but now I do think there's going to be opportunities for us to work in some kind of co-sponsor nature to really help drive value and create value for all of our PE friends out there.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I think it was a great discussion. I certainly learned quite a lot today. With that, Mona, I'd like to turn it back over to you for announcements and just encourage everybody to stick around for the networking events.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.